Night presses against the windows. Frost feathers the glass. You stand in a queue that curls around a bakery door, boots scraping, breath hanging in the coal smoke. Somewhere, a guard stamps to keep feeling in his toes. The first shout hasn't risen yet. The city holds its breath like a lung at the top of winter. If you enjoy walking these knife edges in history, subscribe to What If Wars, so you don't miss where this road leads. You taste paper on your tongue, the taste of rations and forms and promises. Bread arrives late, then thinner. In the alley, a boy counts copper kopecks twice, just in case the price moved between one heartbeat and the next. Over the river, the lamps gutter and flare. You know how this story ends. Crowds, shots, a throne traded for exile. But tonight, the hinge is not in the street. It is a pen scratching in a warm room where steam hisses and a clock ticks too loudly. Before that pen, you go backward. The 1890s are still stamped on your life. Serfs freed but not free. The village commune binding wrists as surely as rope. The mere divides and redivides strips of soil until no plow can breathe. Credit smears into custom and obligation. Grain leaves by the wagon load for export, while your table shrinks to soup. A conductor leans out of a Trans-Siberian carriage, counting freight by lantern. Oil from Baku, coal and rail steel from Donbas. Sacks of rye climbing east to west. The clack of joints under the wheels is a metronome for a nation trying to become modern with the gait of a tired horse. You feel the reach of a minister you never met. He is obsessed with rails and balances, with gold in the vault and contracts in French ink. Interest is a yoke you accept for the sake of machines you cannot yet make yourself. The line cuts through taiga and steppe, and with each station a new hunger appears. Towns swollen around workshops, men arriving faster than wages rise, prices moving like thistle on wind. The city you stand in swallows people and spits out slogans. The year 1905 breaks like black ice. You hear the hum inside the Duma halls, the first time that hum exists, bodies in coats, papers passing, a thin permission to speak. But the room is toy-sized compared to the palace. Budgets are not truly in its hands. Ministers bow toward the throne, not toward a ledger, and you can feel the slack in the system each time a decision must travel through favor rather than law. A seamstress wraps her ration card around 2 fingers and wonders why her life is decided by whispers. Pattern interrupt. A whistle splits the morning, a factory gate opens. You are shoved forward and the bakery door yawns like a wound. The smell of bread is almost nothing, less flour, more ash. You close your fist and think of a farmer you will meet in Tula in a few years. He will plant a fence post with his own hands, and that post will be more than wood. It will be a boundary recognized by a court and by his neighbors. He will sign a paper at a peasant land bank, and the clerk will blot it carefully. The clerk will say without drama that this is how a man invests in his grandchildren. The miracle is not miracle. The pen in the warm room carves a smaller, harder path. A constitutional monarchy that is not a phrase, but a working machine. In this version of your century, the Duma receives real teeth where it matters most: money and war. Budgets pass through committees where arguments must be made in numbers, not in flattery. A cabinet must answer to those numbers, or fall. The court is trimmed like a diseased tree. Fewer branches that can cast a shadow over everything. Less sap wasted on ornament. What does that change for you? Here, now, in the cold? First, time stretches. Bread lines shorten not because slogans soften them, but because grain does not flee the country as proof of prosperity while cities starve. Exports continue, yes, but only after domestic rations clear the threshold that keeps panic from breeding in every mouth. The threshold is written, debated, voted, and printed. You may hate it, but at least you can point to it. Second, the countryside exhales. Stolypin lives long enough in policy, even if men like him do not live forever. Individual small holdings have protection, not just permission. The commune loosens its grip, and a village learns to argue over fences and drainage with a magistrate present, not with a fist. A peasant takes a loan to buy an iron plow. Yields rise just enough that his eldest daughter can keep her boots through spring. When he boards a third-class carriage west to sell his grain, he finds the timetable printed and increasingly accurate. The dispatcher at a Siberian junction taps a pencil against a ledger, calculating turnaround times, and telegraphing a correction before a logjam becomes a famine. Third, the army hears a different voice in peacetime. You feel it in the way officers speak in the yard. Drill sounds less like theater and more like a long insurance policy you hope never to cash. You taste metal in your mouth because the word war is in the air again, as it always is in Europe, but here the plan is not glory. The general staff is pried away from courtly fog and set under a roof where civilian budget men can see them. You don't need to adore any man in epaulets to understand a rule posted on a wall: limited aims, artillery before reputation, a defensive spine that can flex without breaking. Call it professionalization if you like. In this story, we will go to war, but not to waste. You return to the queue. A woman behind you coughs dry. A boy in front of you hums a song he learned from his mother about ships in warmer water than yours, ships that do not freeze at the pier. Warm water ports are a prayer you hardly dare to say aloud. But the prayer is noted, not by saints, by committees, Black Sea harbors, cranes counted, dredging schedules written, winter coal stockpiles tracked with a lime pencil along a warehouse wall. Open loop, and you feel it. None of this is noble. It is tedious salvation, the kind that comes with receipts. The Duma debates will be ugly. Ministers will fall. A rector in Finland will protest curriculum. And a teacher in Riga will measure each word against laws that promise both language and loyalty. You see how easily any of it could still slip. The winter is a knife under the skin of this city. The door opens again, and you step into warmth, into a hiss of steam and the rustle of ration paper. Somewhere across town, the pen scratches a final line. The preventive choice is small enough to miss if you are only watching the streets. Commit to the reforms that bind money, land, and law into one machine. And before the drums roll, commit to a command that fights to endure rather than impress. This is the fork. If it holds, the chant outside never quite finds its pitch. If it falters, you know the rest of the song. You watch your breath fade and think of rails running east with food, of westbound shells arriving in time, because rolling stock was counted in peacetime, not in panic. You imagine a cabinet minister answering questions until his voice cracks, and you feel for the first time that someone's voice is supposed to crack before yours. The clock on the wall ticks like a rail joint under steel. Hold this moment. The next time you hear the whistle, it will carry the sound of mobilization. And whether that sound breaks the empire or bends it will depend on whether tonight's signatures meant anything at all. You meet him in a wooden office that smells of ink and wool. He holds his hat like a second heart. The clerk reads his name, his plot boundaries, the line of a ditch that floods in spring. He signs slowly. First time a signature could decide more than his own pride. The peasant land bank ledger takes the stroke like a ship takes keel. Outside, a horse breathes steam and waits beside a crate with an iron plow packed in straw. You walk with him to the field. The mirror still mutters, but the fence posts stand like teeth. There is a line now that law will defend. The ground resists, then yields. First furrow straight as a vow. In a good season he'll lift yields by a notch or two, say from 6 to 8 centners per deciatina, not a miracle. Just enough to turn a winter from gray to bearable. He tells you he will pay the bank 5 kopecks on the ruble each year and keep a daughter in school. The change does not shout. It shows up in small, regular beats. A tax collector arrives with a printed table instead of a smirk. Arrears narrow. The calendar of payment matches the calendar of harvest. A Zemstvo doctor fills out cards for a vaccination day. The line is long, but not panicked. The farmer's wife lays a ledger on the stove bench and writes down seed bought, oil saved, rent due. You feel a new habit forming in these rooms. Counting before quarreling. You ride third class toward town with him at dawn. The car is cold and crowded, but the timetable posted by the door is not a rumor anymore. A conductor counts freight cars under his breath like a catechism. Coal from Donbas, barrels stinking of Baku oil, sacks of rye that will not leave unless the city ration threshold clears. The dispatcher at a junction taps a pencil to figure if an eastbound milk run can slip between 2 westbound coal strings without freezing the yard. He telegraphs a fix. A passing loop added in summer now shaves an hour from the bottleneck, small as an eyelash, but multiply it across the map and you feel margins thicken. Pattern interrupt. The shriek of a whistle rips the air, and a baker's boy flinches, almost dropping his basket. Your eyes go to the clock nailed to the post. Its hands tremble while the engine brakes. When the cars roll again, the boy breathes out, and the yard with him. In town, the workshop vibrates like a hive. A textile mill whistle bleats the shift change, and you step into heat and lint. A foreman holds a wage envelope, then points to a blackboard with chalk numbers. He tracks bread, lamp oil, rent, and the price of cotton bales that arrive by rail from a southern port he has never seen. If the train is late, I pay twice, he says, not for drama, but because the boiler eats coal on schedule, even if cloth does not leave on schedule. Since the new sidings opened and the rolling stock repairs were centralized, names on rosters, couplers standardized, maintenance done before breakdown, the late days fall. Not to zero, nothing ever falls to zero, but enough that he can promise Sunday pay on Friday and not lie. You watch a seamstress wet her finger to turn ration paper and calculate whether meat fits the week. In last year's winter, she waited 2 hours for bread. This year, she waits 1. The reason is not romance. Grain exports are metered against a visible line. So many pud per head in the city, printed and posted and argued in the Duma, where a deputy can be heckled for pretending numbers are weather. You don't love any of them. You are grateful anyway. Back out by the tracks, a postal carriage opens at midnight. Sacks tumble, each stamped with names you can taste. Odessa, Kazan, Archangel. A letter from a teacher in Riga slides through your hands. She describes a classroom with 2 alphabets on the wall and a lesson plan inspected by a ministry man who leaves a checklist instead of a threat. She does not praise anyone. She reports a fact. Her pupils will sit an exam in their own language and in Russian both. And the budget will follow the head count, not the heat of the latest speech. The engine of this different Russia hums low. It runs on small holdings that can borrow and keep what they grow, on rails that turn around faster than they fail, on budgets that must be defended in rooms where a stenographer takes everything down. You don't mistake it for justice. You note that it is at least visible. When a factory skips pay, a deputy demands the ledger. When a magistrate delays a fence case, a newspaper names him. When the army wants more horses than the district can spare, a clerk produces last year's requisition and dares a colonel to contradict it in ink. You walk the market with the farmer at noon. He counts his day on his fingers: feed, salt, a coil of wire, 2 bolts of rough cloth, the interest coupon for his loan. He cheats nowhere because he does not need to. The taxman will take his due on the date printed, not on the date of the taxman's mood. He asks you if the city will buy eggs next spring at a price that pays for feed. You tell him the Duma argued a floor last week. The newspaper says it passed by 3 votes. He grunts as if this were weather too, but better weather than guesses. By late afternoon, you are back at the edge of the mill district. A foreman explains freight in a way that settles into your bones. Stability is a wage, he says. When a train is a rumor, I dock men I don't want to dock. When a train is a fact, I plan. Outside, the clack of rails is the sound of fact arriving. Not always, but often enough that the rumor shrinks. Evening folds into the streets. Fewer people snake around the bakery. The boy with the basket flips a penny and smiles because he wins the right to carry the lighter load home. You inhale, and the air still tastes of coal, but less of panic. A quiet wind stitches into the day and holds. Then a gust empties the alley and brings you a colder smell, the kind of iron scent that lives in railway sidings before troops board. On a wall, someone has chalked the names of border towns. Mobilization plans rustle in locked drawers. The same rails that carry flour can carry shells. You listen to the yard as if it could tell a secret. It does not. It only keeps time. And somewhere beyond the lamps, storm lines thicken on maps you cannot see yet. Mud grips your boots like hands. You taste metal where fear sits on the tongue. The trench wall is a ledger in clay, bayonet nicks, chalk marks for last night's shells. A junior officer reads the orders twice and then again. The doctrine has changed. No banner chasing, no beautiful arrows for a newspaper map. Defense first, artillery before reputation, limited aims or no aims at all. In this version, you will not be asked to bleed to decorate a communique. You feel the difference in the counting. A quartermaster lays out shell crates and writes a number on each lid with a fat pencil. He points at a board: requirement, delivery, shortfall. The curve spikes in spring 1915 and then eases. Assume the Army needs 100 shells to support a day's sector defense. In our world, it received 40. Here, because procurement moved earlier and standardization hit faster, Donbas steel allocations fixed by civilian budget men who can sack a factory manager. Delivery climbs to 70 by autumn, 90 by midsummer 1916. You still hear the click of empty chambers. You hear fewer of them. Pattern interrupt. A horse screams. You turn to see a team collapse in the mud, hides ribbed thin, harness red with rust. The colonel at the duckboard looks down, then up, and refuses an offensive he cannot feed. He signs his name to a refusal. It is career suicide in many stories. Not here. Here, that signature ends a fantasy and saves a battalion. The cost will come in other forms. The rail yard breathes like a hot animal. You climb into a dispatch office where the windows are smeared with coal dust and breath. A clerk pins colored slips on a map. Bread in blue, ammo in red, horses in green. Freight availability is printed in the top corner. Percentage of pre-war baseline rolling stock, online this week, repaired and fueled. The number is 78%. The rule posted on the back wall is brutal and clear. If availability falls below 70% for 8 consecutive weeks, you trigger the Peace Commission. If city bread ration drops below 1.5 pounds per adult for 14 consecutive days, you trigger it too. You may hate this math. You understand why it exists. The empire vows to survive, not to impress. You step outside and watch a string of flat cars clank past, each with a chalked birthplace. Nikolaev for ship plate, Lugansk for rails, Baku for tank cars that stink of kerosene. A mechanic with a scorch mark on his sleeve tells you why the yards hold up a little better than you remember. Maintenance before breakdown, he says, shrugging. They pulled locomotives early last year to standardize couplers and brake blocks. We curse them then. We thank them now. You think of the Duma hearing, where a deputy waved a broken coupler like a relic until a budget line was passed. Petty politics, you thought. Now it is a train that does not snap in January. At the line, you crouch with a mortar crew that numbers off quietly while the sky coughs shrapnel. The captain's voice is flat. He refuses a day attack because the guns cannot maintain 3 rounds a minute past noon. He refuses a night raid because the cavalry remounts have not arrived. He points at a paper ration posted on the dugout door. Bread down from 2.5 pounds to 1 and 3/4 in Petrograd this week. In this timeline, the line thins but does not vanish. The city curses, but it does not yet break. In hours it did. Casualties drag like chains. You cannot romanticize numbers. Assume through the end of 1916 that frontline losses still reach 1.5 to 1.8 million, wounded and missing swelling beyond that. The difference is not in individual grief. It never is, but in the slope of the curve. Fewer wasteful lunges mean fewer shocks that turn rumor into riot. Field post letters take longer now, but they still arrive. One from a Polish regiment reports a new staff course on map reading that treats peasants like men who can learn. Another from a Finnish battery tells a joke about mud you don't understand, but laugh at anyway. Their pay is late by a week. It is not stolen. The clerk who delayed it is named in a paper. You are sent to a city depot to watch flour weighed. The clerk licks his thumb to turn a page. If we drop under the line for 2 weeks, they will sign, he says quietly. Hard peace. He does not say the word with pride. He says it with the ache of a tooth you cannot afford to pull. A seamstress behind you counts ration stubs and mutters that at least the line exists. Before, she says, the line was a rumor. Now it is a number. In a cabinet room far from the guns, men read graphs like entrails. Rolling stock attrition creeps. Coal pile levels fall under snow. The Minister of War removes his spectacles and says out loud, what everyone has been thinking for a month. We hold the line, or the line will hold us under. The General Staff, now pried out of the court's perfumed rooms and lashed to budget data, argues for a winter of entrenchment, no prestige assaults. A Foreign Secretary, hands white on the chair back, describes channels for a separate peace. The word honor is spoken once. The word famine is spoken 3 times. The empire has been taught a new prayer. Thresholds. The rail number dips to 69% and holds a week, then 2, then 7. Bread rations wobble above 1.5 pounds, then slide under. Deputies from factory districts read petitions into the record until the stenographer's wrist cramps. A colonel testifies about horses that cannot pull guns through a spring thaw because there is no feed. The choice is brought to you plainly. Collapse now and bleed forever, or sign a future you do not love and walk away with your state intact, scarred, armed with time. Pattern interrupt. A telegram bell snaps the room. The foreign secretary reads without moving his mouth. You hold your breath with him as if your lungs could steady his hands. He nods once. The peace is possible, not generous, not clean. Concessions cut like glass, trade terms that favor the other side for now, a corridor for rail that will be argued for a generation, guarantees for border peoples that will be policed in 1,000 small, annoying, necessary ways. No one cheers. Ink dries like frost on window panes. In the barracks, you hear boots stop moving. In the depot, you watch sacks stacked 3 high and bound for city ovens instead of the front. A boy who has never known a quiet winter holds a loaf and does not cry. The empire does not fall into the pit this time. It does not rise singing either. It stands shaking, alive. You know what kind of story this becomes. The hard kind where victories taste like sawdust and survival is a bill you pay in installments. You step into the street and the air smells less of metal. Not sweet, not yet, just less iron. And somewhere beyond the rail yard, a map is being redrawn without a storm tearing the paper in half. The map stops bleeding and starts to bruise. Years pass in the color of ledger ink. You move through a city that learned to hold its breath and then, carefully, to let it out. The empire has not become kind. It has become legible. In a town hall in Kiev, long tables shine with waxen wrists. A deputy explains the tax share to a room that smells of wool and rain. So many rubles to the city, so many to the province, so many to the center, earmarked for rails and schools. Language rights are read aloud like measurements. A clerk notes that petitions can be filed in Ukrainian and Russian both. The budget will follow the head count, not the voice that shouts loudest. The gavel falls once. It sounds like a nail going home. On a morning in Riga, the chalk dust hangs blue in winter light. 2 alphabets ride the board side by side. Children copy lines. The inspector's shoes squeak. He takes a seat at the back and marks a form while the teacher moves through her lesson with a voice strong enough to thread the whole row. Her salary voucher is honest money, if late by a day. She folds it like a letter and slides it between pages. The promise is not glory. The promise is that a lesson plan can outlast a minister. You cut to a bank where the counters gleam like lake ice. In Moscow and Petrograd, mid-market credit has a door with a name and a queue. A shopkeeper from Tver explains turnover. A mill owner explains downtime. A farmer's cooperative sends a representative with a cap in hand and numbers in his pocket. The manager pushes his spectacles up and writes terms that do not sing, but also do not sting. Bonds are issued in quiet rooms, the ink neat, the coupons clipped on a kitchen table by a woman who will use the interest to buy lamp oil and boots. Down in Odessa, the harbor clanks with a wet iron music. A merchant opens a letter of credit that moves grain without making him beg. Cranes swing above him like patient birds. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counts because counting is faith. The foreman logs the movement with a stubby pencil and a frown that means the work is real. A foghorn tears the harbor clean. You flinch and then laugh at yourself. Warm water ports were a prayer once. Now they are a schedule. East again, where derricks in Baku pump as if they could lift the sky on a greasy pole. Tank cars groan. A man slaps the steel flank and listens for emptiness. The line west to the Black Sea has been relayed with fewer bends and more sidings. Throughput rises a notch you can feel in pay packets. In Donbas, furnaces cough and clear. Steel plates slide like winter slabs off a roof. You watch them loaded for shipyards. Nikolaev's bays lit with a witchy blue. Riveters bark. Sparks fall like brief stars. A welder wipes his brow and says, "The wage is better than last year, worse than the year before, and the difference is that he knows why." The Baltic has its own arithmetic. You climb a gray stair in a naval college and read tonnage figures chalked onto a board by a captain who looks like a bookcase. The strategy is prosaic and mean in the best sense. Mines, coastal guns, boats that punch above their weight in cold water. No dreadnought fever, no duel to flatter headlines. The Duma Defense Committee drags admirals through a winter of hearings until answers line up with purchase orders. You stand at the back as a deputy, hoarse and diligent, refuses an ego ship and gets a chain of small vessels that will do the actual work. Across the world, wind scours the bay at Vladivostok. Nets hiss as fishermen haul them up. Beyond the breakwater, a lean destroyer noses along the horizon. You watch officers with notebooks time a patrol as if it were a sermon. Japan's shadow lies long, but it is a calculable shadow, not a superstition. A railroad man in a fur hat rolls a map and taps it with a fingernail where the line snakes down to the coast. 2 trains a day with margin for 3, he says, if we keep the maintenance honest. Then the world tilts. Prices fall like rain in a dry country and flood the wrong places. What they call depression curdles markets from New York to Hamburg. Here, the empire finds out whether legibility is a luxury or a spine. Grain floors hold, barely. Export volumes shrink. The line on the board dips until it touches the trim nail of the committee chairman. Oil royalties cushion one elbow of the budget. The banks call in nothing they do not have to. A credit holiday for smallholders is voted through with the sound of a room too tired to argue. You walk past a shuttered storefront and count the street vendors, fewer than you feared, more than you like. In the afternoon, a newspaper office rattles with the clatter of type. A columnist writes that autonomy is a good word used badly. The editor red pencils 2 adjectives and sends the piece to press. Across the hall, a lawyer drafts a complaint on behalf of a miners' union. It asks for inspectors, not for thunder. The police are present in the street without theater. Permits are stamped in a bland room by a clerk, whose great gift is boredom. A poet reads in a smoky cafe and tests a sentence against the ceiling to see if it will fall back into his tea. It does not. He finishes and bows. Outside, a man with a cold keeps his hands in his pockets and looks at the windows with a face you cannot read. Night draws you to the Black Sea again. A dock worker sits on a coil of rope and counts cranes in the darkness. 1, 2, 3, 4, mouth moving without sound, like prayer, like accounting, like both. He tells you ships came in heavy and left heavier this week, that the cranes stuttered once at noon and then found their pace. He taps his boot against the deck and says that whatever the ministers promise, this is how you know if the state is telling truth. By the speed of a hook, by the swing of a load, by whether a man can plan his Sunday dinner on a Thursday. It would be easy to mistake this for peace. It is something frailer and stranger, a bargain to keep the country running, with the understanding that not everything will be said aloud. You feel the constraint and the relief together, twin weights that balance the scale. You picture a classroom lamp in Riga, a town hall in Kiev, a ledger in Petrograd, a rusted anchor in Odessa, and a rail yard clerk bending over a timetable with a pencil you can almost hear scratching. The confidence you feel is not loud. It is the sound of breath measured, held, released. Is it enough for a life? Enough for a century? You look out over water that does not freeze and try to decide if stability with limits is a harbor or a cage. The sea keeps its promises better than most men. Winter lifts and the Bosphorus glints like a blade. A shipmaster in a wool cap licks his pencil and writes a clean line in the log. Passage in January, without ice delay, pilot taken on time, tonnage declared under limits, agreed by signatures older than his father. He taps the page twice the way sailors do for luck, then looks up at the strait where gulls hang and knife the wind. Down in the engine room, a man wipes his fingers and says, "The oil smells of Baku even after the wash." You breathe the Tory sweetness and realize a treaty can be a kind of weather, unseen, everywhere, setting the mood of a whole coast. A clerk at a customs window stamps papers in a rhythm that sounds like boots on parade. The Straits regime is a dull miracle. Tonnage caps for foreign warships, transit promises for commerce, seasonal clauses that lawyers fuss over and captains obey because they must. In a Black Sea port, a dock foreman runs his thumbnail along a rope and says that rules are what make a hook swing predictably. He counts cranes under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, and you hear the same prayer he said years ago, now spoken to a god named Schedule. You look inland and see the map that could have burned, smoldering only in edges and corners. Without a red empire to define itself against, Berlin still seethes in the long night of factories gone quiet and savings gone thin. Speeches crackle on radios with a heat that tastes like battery acid. Fascism grows anyway, because hunger will water anything. But the pitch is different when the specter in the east is not an ideology promising fire, but a gray, ledger-balanced monarchy promising nothing but continuing. You can feel that denial flatten a melodrama into a calculation. A German general, tracing borders with a knuckle, has to factor not chaos, but a coherent Eastern Bloc, Poland tied by autonomy and tariff to Petersburg, the Baltics held by schools and banks as much as by guns. Nothing inevitable dissolves. Only the odds shift by a hand's width. Pattern interrupt. A radio tone, nasal and insistent, cuts through a cafe. A waiter turns the knob with 2 fingers. The voice reads, "Tariffs." The patrons hoot anyway. You watch a merchant circle a margin on a newspaper next to the price of wheat. He grins a fox's grin because the corridor through the empire will open 1 more week this quarter. He puts his pen behind his ear and orders tea he can suddenly afford. In a barracks yard, a sergeant calls cadence while boys stamp cold feet. The empire remains a hard thing. Censored plays, permits filed and lost and found again. A governor who can still turn his head at the wrong moment and make injustice bloom. Yet, in the drill square, the rhythm speaks of something a continent has not had in a while. Time. Time to standardize artillery fuses. Time to shore up embankments before thaw. Time to lose 2 corrupt contracts before they dig into the whole budget. The officer who once refused an offensive for lack of horses now teaches that refusal as doctrine. He stands before a blackboard and writes, in chalk that squeaks, the phrase every recruit learns by heart: endurance over display. The Pacific keeps its own secrets. At Vladivostok, you watch a destroyer nose out of fog while fishermen coil nets without looking up. Japan watches, counts, adjusts. There are skirmishes in fisheries and a night when 2 boats ram each other, and men curse in languages the sea does not care to separate. But the far eastern line is an abacus worked by quartermasters as often as by admirals. The railroad timetable is pinned above a map, and a colonel with frost in his mustache runs his finger from grain elevators to depots to coves and calculates whether bragging can be afforded. Usually, it cannot. A girl in Riga walks to school with 2 books under one arm, 2 alphabets on their spines. She spells her name twice when the teacher asks, then smiles because she can. In Kiev, a town hall session chews through a tax share debate until cheeks are raw and tongues heavy. In a northern factory, a woman ties her scarf and presses the stamp that confirms an inspector's visit happened and a faulty pulley was replaced. These are not scenes that make posters. These are scenes that make years. Then the world jolts again, as it always does. A question with steel teeth opens its mouth. Does a continent without a revolutionary pole still find a way to tear itself apart? You listen to the newsstand and hear fewer promises of total war and more of police actions, of protectorates, of guarantees traded like cold coins. In one decade, a border burns for 6 weeks, then freezes. In another, planes thrum over a peninsula whose shape you could draw with your eyes closed. Allies and axes still harden, because human beings love banners whether they were fed or not. But what spreads across the century is less a war than a temperature. Call it a cold peace. It hums under speeches, under parades, under train whistles at dawn. It makes for fewer medals and more receipts. Energy is a spine that remembers every hand that touched it. Baku derricks groan, and men in caps argue over royalties in rooms without windows. Rail tankers roll west as they did when you were younger. Only now the couplers bite cleaner, and fewer cars shudder loose at night. A lawyer in Odessa writes clauses for a maritime insurance policy no poet will memorize, and yet a shipmaster in winter reads those clauses by a swinging lamp and decides whether to risk the strait before the moon turns. He licks his pencil and writes, "Proceed." You walk past a bench where an old soldier sits with his cap on his knee. He watches pigeons argue over a crust and does not intervene. His hands remember the weight of a rifle and the weight of a pen, and you can tell which one he prefers now. He lifts his eyes when a small girl runs past, scarf trailing like a flag. Her backpack is heavy with 2 workbooks. She recites a poem in a language her grandmother could not have written at school, then recites a second in the tongue of the capital, because a clerk once wrote that both would receive funding and, surprisingly, the funding arrived. At a market stall, the merchant you met years ago flips a ledger open. The page shows a narrow profit. He grins anyway. Stability has a taste, he says, and you can almost name it. Yeast, oil, the clean tang of cold iron that does not promise to love you, only to hold. The air tonight feels like the first night you stood in that queue, only softer around the edges. Coal smoke thins. The bakery door opens and closes without panic. Somewhere, still, a guard stamps his boots for heat. Somewhere, still, a clerk loses a form and a man curses into his scarf. Nothing perfect arrived. Something survivable did. You ask yourself the question you've been carrying through snow and steam and ledgers. Would you trade upheaval for this? Would you choose the slow hinge over the bright explosion? The wind answers with the dry rattle of paper, the whisper of a pen in a warm room, and the distant clack of rails that have learned to keep time.